The Kremlin is in deep trouble. Every 52 seconds, Ukrainian drones hit a new target. Ukraine is heading for a new record. The pace of these crushing attacks is off the charts, and Moscow simply can't keep up to stop them.
Every day in June, 329 worms and 1,671 enemy targets.
You have to see this, a surprise box that the Kremlin really doesn't want to open. Kiev is no longer warning Moscow. Putin has finally pushed it too far. New secret ballistics flew right in there. Russia's air defense is looking like a net full of holes, trying to catch the wind instead of missiles. And Ukraine is acting like a press, tightening the situation more and more every day. The Russians themselves are giving Magyar prime targets for the strikes. Protected sites are now targets. Russia is tired and ready to finish off the evil empire with its own hands so the war finally ends. Public eye-washing isn't working anymore. Our revenge can no longer be stopped. More on all this next. Watch until the end. Greetings! This is Ukraine Today. I'm Darina Gutskalo with the latest events. Ukraine has made Russia tremble from explosions and strikes following the deadly attack on Kiev. 4 precise strikes at once that literally knocked the ground out from under Putin's feet.
Kstovo, a torch of retribution over the local oil refinery.
As part of reducing the military-economic potential of the Russian aggressor, units of the Ukrainian Defense Forces struck the Lukoil Nizhegorod Nefteorg Syntez oil refinery in Kstovo, Nizhny Novgorod region, Russian Federation.
I've never seen anything like this in person ever. Me neither, by the way. Holy crap. And the fire looks unreal, right? Like it's some kind of graphics. Yeah.
The key target is Putin's oil vein, 800 kilometers from the border with Ukraine. One of Russia's largest oil refineries, which produce gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel, seems to be shutting down for good now. The Ukrainian Defense Forces have hit at least 3 more of the Kremlin sore spots. In the Kamyanka area of Zaporizhzhia, an enemy drone warehouse was destroyed. Another hub that was serving the Russian war effort. A railway bridge over the Siversky Donets near Stanitsia Luhanska was also hit, a key logistical artery through which the occupiers moved equipment, ammunition, and personnel. Now, it seems this route is becoming significantly less convenient. And another important detail, an enemy command and observation post was hit near Vilshana in the Kharkiv region. This means that even local command is becoming increasingly difficult for them.
The defense forces of Ukraine will continue to systematically carry out measures aimed at ending the armed aggression of the Russian Federation.
In the Kremlin offices, they don't know what to do with themselves. Air defense has been breached. Protecting the sky is no longer even an option.
Just look, everything's warped. Everything, in short, everything. Police, ambulance, everyone's here.
And at this moment, Ukraine has apparently pulled out its main trump card, the new FP9 ballistic missile. The Russian Ministry of Defense is hastily filing reports while Russian bloggers cannot contain their emotions. The Moscow region has taken the brunt of the battle.
During a missile alert in the Moscow region, anti-aircraft missile systems were recorded operating at high altitudes, which is uncharacteristic for a drone or cruise missile flight. Also, a large crater formed at the crash site of the downed object. It is possible that this could have been an interception of a Ukrainian ballistic missile.
The level of tension is only heightened by the recent statement from Dennis Stillerman. Just a week ago, Firepoint hinted that a Ukrainian ballistic missile capable of reaching Moscow is practically on the home stretch.
Right now, we are developing ballistics that will be able to reach both Moscow and St. Petersburg, because Russia is such a monocentric country where everything is concentrated in one place, unlike Ukraine. And we have everything. Right now, we're conducting ground tests of the engine, and in the near future, we'll start flying. That's it. Then we'll be testing the missile on Moscow.
If confirmed, the launch of a ballistic missile would mark a new step in Kiev's efforts to expand its domestic long-range strike capabilities beyond drones and cruise systems.
So apparently, now not only the Flamingo but also the FP9 reaches where the Kremlin felt safe. New explosive events are just around the corner. The Russians themselves will help the defense forces of Ukraine with this. There is already experience.
Thanks to Artem and his professional work, on June 21, 2026, a report by Volgograd Vesti was released about the secrets of the Russian defense enterprise Titan Barricadi. From this story, we managed to learn many interesting things about the current operations of the enterprise.
In the mechanical assembly shop, Igor Kovshov spends hardly less time than in the design bureau. This work apparently pleased the defense forces so much that they decided not to delay their visit. Already on June 27th, the decision was made to pay a visit to this plant as personally as possible using the Flamingo. And it looks like this will be anything but a formal visit. Realizing that retribution is inevitable, real paranoia has set in Moscow. Yandex has hastily blurred satellite images of the main Russian Ministry of Defense buildings on Frunzenskaya embankment and completely removed the outlines of key defense industry enterprises from its maps. The occupiers naively and pitifully think that if they erase their rocket and space centers from Russian search results, they won't be targeted. But they're forgetting one fatal detail. On the targeting screens of Ukrainian operators, all these secret targets are as clear as day. Hiding is futile. Ukrainian vengeance will find everyone. Moscow is increasingly looking like a city where the war has finally arrived directly. Drones are now regularly breaking through to the Russian capital and strategic sites are coming under attack. The Kremlin keeps repeating that everything is under control. But the more strikes are recorded in Russia itself, the louder the air defense operates over residential areas, and the more often new crises arise, the harder it is to hide the truth. Reality is already breaking through the television illusions that Putin has been building for years. More on this next. Moscow can no longer pretend that the war is somewhere far away. What for years was shown to Russians on TV as someone else's misfortune has suddenly started knocking on the windows of the country's most expensive neighborhoods. The capital, accustomed to living with the certainty of being protected by state-of-the-art air defense systems and an endless military budget, has faced a very harsh reality. Drones are arriving again and again, and residents are increasingly waking up not to alarm clocks but to explosions and the roar in the sky. What's particularly troubling for Muscovites is that at the critical moment there is only silence. The sirens are silent and no warnings are issued. People only learn of the danger when the distinct sound of engines is heard over their homes or when anti-aircraft systems start firing in the sky. And that's where the main question arises. If the capital of the world's largest country is under attack, why haven't the authorities explained basic safety rules to its citizens yet? It turns out that Moscow, portrayed for decades as the center of a mighty superpower, is completely unprepared for life under an aerial threat. People are searching for shelter maps on their own, sharing addresses in chats and forums, calling officials, and trying to figure out where to run in the event of another attack. But instead of clear answers, they often find themselves in a bureaucratic labyrinth. In some districts, information is withheld. In others, they're told to visit the administration in person. It seems that finding a safe place in the capital is much harder than finding another propaganda story about having the situation under full control. Meanwhile, the sky over Moscow is increasingly becoming a source of fear. Russian air defense, showcased for years at parades as a symbol of invincibility, is now forced to operate directly over residential neighborhoods. Debris falls to the ground, explosions ring out near homes, and residents watch it all from their balconies and courtyards. This looks especially telling against the backdrop of the Kremlin's long-standing claims of the capital's absolute safety. Even more outrage is caused by the authorities' reaction following the attacks. Instead of explaining to people how to act during danger, officials and security forces focus on fighting information. Posting photos and videos of strikes becomes a bigger irritant for the system than the strikes themselves. It seems the main task remains not protecting the population but maintaining an image of calm on television screens. Against this backdrop, the gap between ordinary Muscovites and the top of the Russian government becomes especially noticeable. While some take their children to bathrooms in the middle of the night, away from windows, and try to find shelter, others continue to live behind the high fences of closed residences. For ordinary residents, the attacks have become a part of everyday life. For the political elite, they still remain something distant, existing only in reports and press releases. And at the same time, Moscow demonstrates a strange contrast. In one part of the city, people read news about new strikes, check neighbor chats, and listen to every unusual sound. In another, social events, loud presentations, and parties continue as if someone is persistently trying to prove that nothing is happening. But each new attack shatters this illusion even more. Today, the main fear of Muscovites is not the drones themselves. What scares them most is the realization that the system, which promised absolute protection for years, was not ready for the test. And every time after new explosions in the capital, more and more people ask themselves the same question: if the authorities cannot guarantee safety in the very heart of Russia, then how truthful were all the other Kremlin promises? And in the Kremlin, they haven't even changed their tune. There, it seems, exists some parallel reality in which oil depots don't burn, fuel shortages don't occur, and drones reaching the Russian capital have no impact at all. This is exactly the picture Putin painted in another conversation with court propagandist Zarubin. While the whole country sees regular strikes on strategic targets, the Russian president assures all means of protection are there, the system works, and the problems are not critical. If translated from Kremlin speak to human language, it goes something like this: there's not enough gasoline, but there's no shortage. Facilities are burning, but there's almost no damage. Drones arrive, but they have no impact whatsoever. It seems the main task of the Russian authorities today is not to solve the problem, but to convince the population that the problem doesn't exist. Even the fuel crisis is actually being presented by the Kremlin as an element of a Ukrainian information operation. Gas station lines? That's not a shortage. Supply disruptions? Not a problem. Strikes on energy infrastructure? Nothing serious. Everything works stably and with a large margin of safety. At least in words. However, the longer this performance lasts, the harder it is to hide the obvious. If all defense systems work perfectly, then why do Moscow residents wake up to explosions? If the strikes don't matter, then why do the authorities react so nervously to every video of a hit? If the fuel situation is under control, then why publicly explain to the population that supplies will only last for a few more days? But the most ambitious part of the speech wasn't even the talk about the economy or air defense. Putin spoke again about major offensives, future conquests, and victories. From the Kremlin offices, everything looks extremely simple. Just a few kilometers left to one city, even less to another. A little more and another Ukrainian defense will supposedly crumble. There is only one awkward detail in these statements. The Russian leadership has been repeating most of these forecasts for many months, and in some cases, years. The more difficulties accumulate inside Russia itself, the more grandiose the promises from the TV screens become. While Muscovites search for bomb shelters, they are told about future conquests of new territories. While regions face fuel problems, they are told that the enemy is about to be surrounded. While drones reach strategic targets, they are shown a picture of absolute control. And that is exactly what the main paradox of Russia is today. The real country is increasingly facing the consequences of the war. The television country continues to live in a world of endless victories, breakthroughs, and grandiose plans. And the wider the gap between these two realities becomes, the louder the Kremlin has to repeat its favorite phrase: everything is under control. Ukraine will take the Kremlin by storm. Zelensky's final order: Kiev gave Putin only 40 days. The SBU will not wait any longer. The end of the Russian Federation will be louder than ever. The war has finally entered its final stage. The Crimean hell is unfolding even more intensely. Strikes are becoming even more precise, and the main target, the Crimean bridge, is no longer so unreachable. Even Moscow has become a frontline city. Putin is simply unable to protect it. Are our people really waiting around the corner of the Kremlin fortress? What will happen next? Let's watch. 40 days for the Kremlin. While Russian propaganda continues to talk about stability and control over the situation, Moscow may soon be sung a funeral dirge. Kiev has approved a plan that could seriously spoil the mood of many residents of the Kremlin offices. Volodymyr Zelensky announced the launch of a special 40-day operation to influence Russia, the main goal of which is to force the aggressor to think about ending the war. The most interesting thing is that this is not about loud statements or diplomatic ultimatums. It's about the fact that in recent months, Russia has been increasingly feeling strikes on military facilities, warehouses, logistics, airfields, and enterprises working for the Russian war machine. And it seems that they have now decided to intensify this work even further. Particular attention is drawn to the fact that the basis of the new campaign is precisely the capabilities of the security service of Ukraine. According to Zelensky, SBU units have been demonstrating some of the best results at the front for several months in a row thanks to the use of various types of drones. And the Alpha Special Operations Center is generally called one of the leaders in terms of the amount of Russian equipment and manpower destroyed. And while the Russian leadership used to be able to convince the population that the war was somewhere far away, now more and more Russian regions are regularly in the news due to explosions, drone attacks, fires at strategic sites, and transport collapses at airports. It seems that Kyiv is increasingly shifting the focus from fighting for individual kilometers of the front to creating problems for the entire Russian military system. And if before this Moscow spoke about the exhaustion of Ukraine, now they increasingly have to explain to their own citizens why another airfield, factory, or warehouse has once again become the center of an emergency situation. The number 40 days itself looks particularly symbolic. In the Kremlin, they've probably already gotten used to counting missiles, drones, and sanctions, but now it seems they'll have to count the days as well. Days during which the Ukrainian special services plan to remind the Russian authorities of a simple thing. The longer the war lasts, the more expensive it becomes for Russia itself. And if the last few months have already forced Moscow to pull air defense systems to the capital, shift resources to protect the residents, and save the most important sites, then the main intrigue now lies elsewhere. How painful will the next 40 days be for the Kremlin, and will this campaign become the final ironclad argument that continuing the war is costing Russia more and more? And while the SBU launches a new large-scale pressure campaign against Russia, the situation on the front for the occupiers is also getting worse and worse. Especially where the Kremlin until recently felt almost safe. In Crimea, the peninsula that Russian propaganda for years called an unsinkable aircraft carrier increasingly resembles a territory of total logistical disaster. The biggest hysteria in recent days was caused by the Russian ZDW correspondents themselves. The reason is quite telling. Ukrainian drones have begun systematically hunting not only warehouses, radars, or air defense systems, but also the so-called mobile fire groups of the occupiers. The very units that were supposed to protect Russian columns and cover Crimea from air attacks. And here, it turned into an almost classic Russian story. The command decided to save its cargo by placing an armed escort near it. But the opposite happened. If before Ukrainian operators had to search for a valuable target, now the Russians themselves have started marking it. If you see a column with a mobile fire group, it means there's something important inside. Then the drones get to work. The scale of the problem can no longer be hidden even by Russian propaganda. If at the beginning of the year the occupiers were losing about 4,000 units of motor transport per month, now the count is already in the tens of thousands. In just a partial June, losses exceeded 10,000 units of equipment and some days set new records. But the real nightmare for the occupiers begins near the Crimean coast. The Russians have placed mobile fire groups along the coastline to shoot down Ukrainian drones. It would seem like a logical decision if not for one problem. Ukrainian sea drones are now going out to hunt these groups themselves. As a result, the hunters are increasingly turning into the prey. In effect, Crimea has found itself caught between two fires. From the land, Ukrainian drones continue to methodically destroy the occupiers' logistics. From the sea, naval platforms and FPV drones are in operation. And Russian mobile groups meant to provide defense are increasingly becoming just another line in the casualty statistics. The most unpleasant thing for the Kremlin is that this no longer looks like isolated episodes. It looks like a systematic campaign. First, Ukrainian forces began knocking out radars and air defense systems, then they moved on to logistics. Now the turn has come for the lowest level of Russian air defense. And each new step makes life increasingly difficult for the entire group of occupiers on the peninsula. Meanwhile, multi-kilometer traffic jams are being recorded near the Kerch Bridge. According to satellite data, about 1,500 cars could have accumulated in the queue, and the column itself stretched for about 10 kilometers. In Russian social media, this is already being called an absolute record, which supposedly never happened before. But behind these emotional formulations lies a fairly simple reality. Movement through the key artery of the occupied peninsula is becoming less and less predictable. Amid strikes on infrastructure and fuel problems, any trip turns into a multi-hour wait and sometimes an attempt to simply get off the peninsula. As a result, the Kerch Bridge increasingly looks not like a reliable corridor, but like a bottleneck where queues, nerves, and the consequences of general logistical instability accumulate. And the peninsula itself in this picture is gradually moving into a mode of constant transport pressure, where even leaving becomes an ordeal. Crimea, which in Russian propaganda was presented for years as a fortress of security, increasingly looks like a region where logistics collide, pressure on the military system grows, and everyday tension accumulates. And while some try to patch holes and transfer resources, others continue to methodically shake the very foundation of this calm, making the situation for the occupiers not just difficult, but systematically unstable. The worse things go for Russia at the front, the louder the Kremlin's propaganda screams. Losses are growing, logistics are cracking, and every kilometer costs the occupiers an extremely high price. That is why Moscow so desperately invents new successes. But lately, its victories only live until they collide with reality. Ukraine has finally managed to break the course of events. All about this in detail in just a moment. In Russia, they have already invented a new kind of military victory. Run in, wave a flag in front of the camera, and you can report a successful offensive to Putin. However, this time the show ended much faster than the Russian propagandists had time to enjoy their own headlines. In the Zaporizhzhia direction, the occupiers solemnly announced the alleged capture of Novoselivka and Huliai-Pilsky, and propagandists have already started talking about another major breakthrough by the Russian army. However, this entire grand operation fit into a short video and a few loud headlines. The scenario was simple. A group of Russian stormtroopers ran to the outskirts of the settlements, unfurled the tricolor, recorded the necessary footage, and obviously were already preparing to receive applause from their superiors. In Moscow offices, they were likely already popping champagne while propaganda channels rushed to depict another historic victory. But between the video and the actual situation at the front, a small problem arose once again: reality. As soon as the cameras were turned off, a completely different story began. Ukrainian drones targeted the liberators, and the entire loud victory performance instantly turned into an operation to eliminate its participants. One of the occupiers, who just minutes ago was posing with a flag for Russian news, ended up in Ukrainian captivity. This is becoming the signature style of the Russian army. First paint a victory and only then face what is actually happening on the battlefield. While Kremlin propagandists count imaginary successes, the Ukrainian military counts very real results of their work. And the louder Moscow shouts about its triumphs, the more often it turns out that this whole victory ended before the propaganda segment was even finished being edited. And this is far from the only case where the Russian authorities substitute reality with beautiful fairy tales. Putin himself personally joined this process. During his recent statements, he painted an incredibly rosy picture of the Russian offensive. However, the facts and Frontline maps say otherwise. The master of the Kremlin stated that in the Lyman area, the occupiers only have 149 houses left to liberate out of over 11,000. It sounds formidable, but the problem is that most of the city remains under the control of the defense forces, and Russian assault groups only occasionally seep into certain areas of the eastern part of the city. In other words, the distance between Putin's words and reality is no less than the distance between Kremlin dreams and their actual results. No less interesting are the statements about Sloviansk and Sumy. The Kremlin says that Russian troops are only 8 to 9 kilometers away from Sloviansk, although the actual distance is about twice as far. The situation with Sumy is no better. Putin speaks of 10 kilometers to the city, while in reality it is 17 to 20 kilometers, and the front line there has barely changed for months. Especially fantastic was the story about the alleged breakthrough of the impregnable Ukrainian defense line near Dobropilya. Putin even rushed to announce that there are almost no Ukrainian fortifications beyond the city. However, in practice, Russian units are still dozens of kilometers away from the lines he is talking about. It turns out that the Kremlin is already celebrating the overcoming of defenses that its troops have not even reached yet. And the real gem was the statement about the nearly completed encirclement of a large Ukrainian grouping near Rubtsy. According to Putin, only a few kilometers remain until the circle is complete. However, even a basic look at the map shows that there are still about 10 kilometers between the Russian positions and the area that is supposedly on the verge of encirclement. It seems the Russian leadership has long been fighting on two fronts at once. On one real front, where progress comes at a huge cost and does not always bring results. On the second television channel, where you can capture cities, surround armies, and break through defenses with a single stroke of a pointer on a map. And while propaganda counts imaginary kilometers and non-existent victories, the front continues to stubbornly remind the Kremlin that reality works a bit differently. However, speaking of Russian fantasies, the story of the flag in Zaporizhzhia, or Putin's latest claims of a successful offensive, is just a small episode in a much larger performance. In fact, the Kremlin has been painting a victory over Donbas for 4 years in a row now, and every time the result is the same. Loud promises, menacing deadlines, and yet another postponement of the dates. The president of Ukraine also pointed this out. According to Volodymyr Zelensky, since the start of the full-scale war, the Russian leadership has set a date for the total capture of the Donetsk region at least 15 times.
Russia's political leadership is constantly obsessed with Donbas. 15 times already they've had this delusion that they would fully capture Donbas. In 2022, the deadlines were March 31st, then May 9th, June 1st, September 15th, and December 31st. In 2023, Putin set 2 more deadlines for the capture of Donbas. By March 1st, and then, when it failed again, they moved it to December 31st. In 2024, there were 2 such deadlines again. In 2025, when the Russians tried to convince President Trump that Ukraine would supposedly fall, there were already 3 deadlines. By September 1st, by December 1st, and by December 25th.
After such a list, it's hard to understand what exactly Russia considers its main military operation. Assaults on the front or the regular postponement of deadlines? It seems the only thing the occupiers have managed to take full control of over these years is their own calendar. They've captured Donbas so many times that they should have reached not just Kramatorsk but Mars by now. But every time stubborn reality broke the Kremlin's presentations. It looks especially funny that even in 2026, this performance continues. At first, Moscow dreamed of closing the Donetsk issue by March 31st, then the deadline was quietly pushed to September 1st. Now the new milestone is December 31st, and there's little doubt that if nothing changes at the end of the year, Russian propaganda will solemnly announce another very close victory that will just have to be postponed a bit.
If Russia doesn't end its war, they will have to postpone this deadline once again. If Putin wants to sacrifice another million of his soldiers to keep hitting this wall, then the million Russians not yet mobilized into the army who are arguing in gas lines should think about what awaits them next.
And here the main question arises, if in 4.5 years of war the Kremlin has almost captured Donbas 15 times, hasn't this whole story turned into the largest series of broken promises in modern military history? Because while Russian officials draw new arrows on maps and invent new dates for their victories, the front continues to stubbornly remind them of one unpleasant thing. The gap between TV and reality is growing ever wider. And what do you think about the latest events? Share your thoughts in the comments, like the video and stay up to date with the main news. More to come. See you!